Moses Kamibaru. First of all, thank you for having me here. I appreciate that. So, who am I? I've been entrepreneur for now, actually 20 years through my company, Sabi. We are a digital agency. I've been serving clients, since the early days of building websites and the likes to date. I'm a father of three, two girls and one boy. I I love technology end to end. I'm a gadget freak, as it were. I'm an aspiring runner. I've been running lately since the pandemic began, and that's been a really good thing. And yeah, I'm somebody who's generally very passionate about the idea that SMEs in particular in Africa really, I think, present the biggest potential going forward. And I'm saying this from the fact that when I see the work we do in our digital marketing, that, you know, as we used to say in the early days of the internet, it can be the great leveler if you know what you're doing on digital, especially as we've seen in the pandemic, to create value and opportunity for businesses that potentially could never be successful. Yeah, so my upbringing was actually in Mombasa. That's where I was brought up. Went to school in Mombasa. My family was originally from Tanzania, but my folks settled there in the late '60s, I think. And yeah, we grew up in Mombasa. It was a very nice environment, I think, for families to bring up children. I have very very fond memories of that. Um, and I think my earliest memories of computers, I think, was when um, many years ago, I think I went to an event where I think IBM was showcasing the earlier IBM PCs. We're not really talking about the early '80s, I suppose. And I went to an event at a place and I saw these computers and I was initially hooked. And then I remember shortly after that, my dad at some point bought a ZX Spectrum computer, a home computer called the ZX Spectrum, Sinclair ZX Spectrum. And that was probably my first exposure to the whole notion or idea of computing. And for us as a family, it was almost like a toy or a gadget, I guess, in the same way that people now have PS4s or PS5s for their kids in the home. But in order to use this computer, we had to actually, my father came with a booklet which allowed us to create the games that would play on the Spectrum. So me and my immediate older brother, many late nights on the weekends would want to play the games, but we had to learn how to code them to play them. So we'd sit there, I think, writing in BASIC. And, I think for me, the magical moment was figuring out what the code meant and writing the code, figuring out the loops, figuring out that if I did this, I could give my character infinite lives. I could, do things that were amazing if I knew what the code meant. And I think that's my first exposure to the idea or the notion that, software would give you superpowers within this environment of creating a digital experience. And I think from then on, what happened is when I was very young, I actually my dad bought a computer. He was a civil engineer. So he had a structural analysis and design software that he purchased in the UK. He needed a computer. I think he bought it from Copycat, who were one of the first resellers of the Amstrad computers. Got it installed. My brother at the time was also pursuing a degree in engineering in the US, and he came back with some upgrades for that computer. But basically, this computer allowed him to improve how he was doing his structural analysis and design. And of course, being the geek that I was, when the weekends would roll up or he'd pick me up from school and go back to the office, maybe he's finishing up, I'd spend time on his computer, including a few times installing viruses by mistake from the 5.4 inch, 5.25 inch floppy disks, if any of you remember those. And I managed to, occasionally install the earliest forms of viruses, I suppose. But what happened is through that enthusiasm, he actually also got me enrolled in some computer classes where I was this young, I think, primary school student, and there were accountants and people who are working in senior positions in companies learning how to do computers and spreadsheets on Lotus 123 and DB3 and DB4. And there was this young kid with them in class learning how to create software and stuff. So I was very fortunate that my father gave me the opportunity to learn all these things, exposed me to the computers, even paid for me to go for classes when there was no real value at the point. And I think that started to sort of shift my mentality towards the idea of a career in that. And of course, at that point in Kenya, I couldn't say that there was any, tech ecosystem like the way we have it today, but it was really the early seeds of that. And of course, when I went to high school. The school where I was at had Apple computers, I think the Apple II. So again, I dabbled in those. And then when I got to university, I was part of the computer club at USIU, continued my computer obsession, continued doing extra classes during the holidays. And somewhere along the way, it became apparent there was something interesting happening in the world called the internet. And during the course of that is when I think when I was still at USIU, I think that's when it was starting to happen. Um, anyway, I started to get a hint that something was happening, and I thought it might be an opportunity. But yeah, that was kind of like the beginnings of the sort of computer obsession and technology enthusiasm that I got as a young person. Very early, very early.
Something very important after university, you joined a few organizations, key among them being Africa Online, which I believe is one of the first ISPs in the country, if not in Africa. How did you end up there, and what was your experience in these formative years of the internet in Kenya?
So let me start off from first of all the journey to get to the internet. I think for me, because I was already exposed to computers, I was reading all the magazines, computers, attending classes, learning stuff, but I didn't have a job as such in that space. And I think what happened is as I left university and I started to sort of figure out what I'm going to do next. I had two options. I thought maybe a career in hospitality, possibly in something to do with computers. I didn't know what exactly it would be at that point. And as I was dabbling around, I remember I would spend a lot of time at the British Council. They had a lot of good books those days. That was our internet those days. You go to the library and read books, and I was learning everything from Unix to stuff from books. Going home and installing software, doing stuff. And I was kind of unique at that point. I don't think anyone was like doing what I was doing. I was just trying to understand what was going on. And the magical moment, I think, as we started hearing about the internet, was the day I think when Netscape announced its IPO. And for me at that time, I think I was the same age as Mark Andreessen, right? And I'll never forget this. It is an iconic cover. I think it was Fortune magazine or Time magazine, and Mark Andreessen, who I think is with the Andreessen Horowitz organization at that time, I think was like a 24-year-old. And I saw this cover and I was like, this kid who's my age, is now worth $42 million, right? And I looked at this thing and I was like, what is this? How is this even possible? And I remember thinking to myself, if this thing called the internet can create a 24-year-old millionaire in dollars, and I know the things he knows, or I have the potential to, then I must find a way into this space. So at the very initial stages, the next thing for me was like, very obviously, I need to understand more about this. And I literally remember I came for a conference in Nairobi. I think it was, if you remember, iTech, one of the earliest conferences. I came there, I met a lot of interesting people. There were some guys from South Africa where the internet was already taking off. I remember during the same trip, I went and had my first browser experience where I went to the Africa Regional Center for Computing, or ARCC, where Shem Ochwodo was doing this. I started communicating with him from the conference, and he obliged me one afternoon, and I went to their location, I think on Gong Road, sat at this computer. It was an Apple computer, and I opened something called Netscape, stuff I've been reading about but never experienced. And these guys, I think at that point, were on an analog lease line, and I opened the internet, and I remember it was so exciting because you're sitting at this computer and you're accessing Yahoo and the websites that were endemic at the time to the internet. It was very mesmerizing because I mean I just like, this is the future. This is going to be the future. Open an email account. At that point I think Africa Online was just about to start opening their full-time internet connection. My brother at the time was running the family business and they had an email address, so that's how I was sending emails back and forth. So I really sort of pursued it. I really wanted to get into it. And initially, my idea of thinking initially was that, well, there were no real companies employing and all that at that point. I was like, well, why don't I start my own ISP? So I got into the whole space thinking that I would own an ISP. I saw that in Mombasa around that time, no one had a local point of presence for internet. So we got together with another guy from the US, a Kenyan who was there, and we were trying to see how to. He was a computer scientist in the US, and we incorporated the company and were meant to set up this ISP. So I got my family to donate some money for this cause. We tried to get it off the ground, and then we had some disagreements, lost the money. And I sat there and I said to myself, what am I going to do? I don't have the money to start this business. Um, I need to look for a job. And I remember quite clearly I sent my CV out to several companies. At that point, there was Africa Online and there was Formnet. Those were the two active internet service providers on the ground. And as I was doing this, I remember very fortunately, Formnet at the time responded to me. They were now opening their Mombasa branch, or just opened their Mombasa branch. Very coincidentally, the lady who was running it down there was a had gone to school with my sister, and she remembered the name and said, "Hey, I think I know you. Why don't you come and work for us?" And that's how I started. So, and for me, it was mesmerizing to sit in an office where, in one of the few places in the country, you had high speed internet in the office 24/7. I lived in that office late into the nights, spend the full day in the weekends, learning things, figuring out the internet, installing people's internet connections in their homes because my role was sales and customer service, uh, you know, troubleshooting stuff, and basically just immersing myself into all things internet, whether it was, building my first website, or going to a customer's office to debug an internet connection. Because remember, we had analog connections and you could actually program the modems to connect better. So there's like a jack of all trades. I learned all these things about, the content side and the connectivity side as well.
Just like most people with great ambitions, your start wasn't really smooth, as you say,
Yeah.
but you managed to get yourself into Africa Online.
Yes.
There are some, initially when most people join that space, focus mostly on the infrastructure and connectivity side, as you said. At what point did the bug about content bite you, so to speak? When did you realize that there's a lot of potential on the internet content more than the connectivity?
I think it's sort of, I think there were two pushes there. One is I remember being very keen, or rather aware of the fact that being in Mombasa at the time, that it was a touristic destination, and the majority of the hotels and touristic establishments did not have websites. And I remember sitting there, that time I was obviously working at Formnet and thinking, wow, that could be a big opportunity. But as all this was going on, I remember thinking that I would definitely want to create content, because I started building my own website using a site called GeoCities, which at some point was acquired by Yahoo, I believe. And that allowed me to experiment and start to sort of build a free website. Started dabbling in community websites. And that was the content piece and the connectivity side. I think the time when I really got into the content side was actually when I moved to Africa Online. And what was actually happening on the ground is, because I was fairly well networked in Mombasa society at that point in time. I was in Rotary, I was, in the social scene. And somehow I was excelling at selling internet connectivity, because I think I understood at a fundamental basis the product and I understood the market. So I was kind of the guy selling the most connections in town at some point. And that caught the attention of the people over at Africa Online, who I think had previously actually rejected my application to join them. So as we hit the ground and I'm there, I'm closing numbers, I'm killing it in sales. It caught the attention of the people, like, hey, there's something happening in Mombasa, and there's this guy who seems to be closing numbers. So they reached out to me, and it turned out that my former colleague, or rather my former schoolmate from USIU, who I used to play rugby with, and this is where you understand the rugby fraternity is very, as a brotherhood. He saw that I was making such good headway on the ground. He'd been assigned to Mombasa. He reaches out to me. I told him I was rejected. He went all the way back to Nairobi during one of the trips, and he got my CV from the files. Told the management, "This guy's doing a good job. We better bring him in." So I had a secret meeting with the local management there, and they offered me a very compelling offer, very aggressive commission structure that would make me a lot of money. And then I opted to join over. But now, when I moved over to Africa Online and I continued to do the selling, what was very clear is that Africa Online had this platform called africaonline.com. And they had built a very substantial content platform and were building a lot of websites for customers. And for me, it sort of aligned with my interests in terms of, it's one thing to connect people. The next order is to use that connectivity to create value for businesses and brands. And as we went into the market, I started doing a dual purpose role of connecting people, but also selling websites on the ground, which somehow I actually was able to do well. Subsequently, Africa Online launched a content division that they called Internet Business Solutions, or IBS. And I was given the opportunity to head that up in Mombasa, because remember, this is a touristic destination. There's a lot of business potential on the ground, businesses that needed to market online. So I was then tasked with setting it up, hiring a web developer or web designer, or I think we used to call them webmasters, and actually hitting the ground and selling. And during the Africa Online period is when really my intent or interest or realization that content was actually the most important thing, now that connectivity was sorted, would be where the big opportunities would happen going forward. So that was really the catalyst that got me thinking about where I could go next.
Very chaotic for you. How would you measure the performance at that time in terms of the types of websites that the customers were delivering? Were they impactful, or were they having the effect that you had expected once you sell a customer website and they host it? Or was it just a fad then?
No, many of these websites were the very first that were being launched in this part of the world. So what you tend to find, because the internet was almost like where Africa was concerned, still the dark continent or maybe the dark digital continent, by virtue of the fact that these guys had websites, if somebody was punching in, Mombasa Hotel or Mombasa Safaris or something of the sort, many of these websites would always rank highly. And remember, that was pre-Google. That's when we had Alta Vista and other very simple search engines. So many of the websites we built within a very short period of time would garner traffic and customers would actually be acquiring business. We had customers across the Kenya coast all the way from Malindi, going up to Lamu and so forth. We had customers right across. But because they were the first and few, literally they dominated that space because no one else existed. In terms of the ambiguity of a new and nascent space, I think really we just went into it believing we could make it work. There was no benchmark, there was no roadmap or any sort of blueprint that we could follow. So you just sort of got there. We came up with rate cards. We visited customers and said, hey, there's this thing called the internet, and we can put your business online. And then work with the designers, work with the teams, build the sites, host them within the infrastructure we had at Africa Online. We had some very rudimentary analytics softwares to check how things were working. But by and large, because of the africaonline.com, which was a huge site then, the equivalent of, let's say, an African Yahoo, we were able to use that as sort of the platform to drive traffic to these websites. So, many ways, the Africa Onlines were very instrumental in creating sort of a content platform, which would then create the visibility and awareness for the clients when their websites came online. And again, like I said, there was no blueprint. We were making this stuff as we went along. And of course, there were some hits, but there were also some misses.
From what I gathered, the African Online was more of a search engine.
Exactly. Correct. Yeah. And remember, the very limited local destinations online. Remember that, right? So even at that point, you'll find that a lot of the media platforms like Nation Media were actually using Africa Online as their content platform. So they would publish the newspapers and all on behalf of the Daily Nation every day for them on the platform. For that reason, with diaspora, with anyone looking for content from Kenya or any market where Africa Online was operational in Africa, they essentially became the de facto content destination across many markets in the African continent. And therefore, inherently, we're like a virtual Google in terms of generating traffic then for the clients who are listed in those directories and spaces within that particular website. With floppy disks.
With floppy disks, because even their office link couldn't upload that content.
This is at Union Towers, right?
Union Towers and also at Parkside.
Yes, I remember that. Yeah, on Mombasa Road. Yeah, yeah.
Interesting. Now, you found yourself at 3 Mice. Can you tell us the story of 3 Mice? Maybe even tell us who the 3 Mice are.
So 3 Mice was interesting because I think the year was 1999, 98. I remember we were there, we were working in Africa Online, we were working in this internet business solutions department, building websites. And of course, we had all the big boys, the big banks, the Barclays, all these people were our clients. We were dominating in websites. But in the midst of all this, I remember very quickly and very suddenly, we started seeing websites popping up because, again, there was only a handful in Kenya relatively. And we kept seeing this, like three paws at the bottom. And, a company called Three Mice. We didn't know who they were. When Africa Online were like the market leader. If you can think of it this way, we were the Google of the day, right? We were the Google of the day in Kenya. And I didn't know who these guys were. And I was working with a guy called Kevin Oma, who was my webmaster at the time in Mombasa. And turns out he knew one of the founders of Three Mice, who's Ken Joroge, right? Who's now Ken of formerly Cellulant. And he kind of introduced me to them. But what happened is Kevin got poached by Three Mice as they were coming up, right? And that was a big deal because Three Mice was like the new kid on the block. Everyone in the digital or internet space was like, wow, they're building amazing websites. I think they built the first e-commerce platform, which was Virtual City. They did the Kenya Postal Directories, the Yellow Pages website, which had been an Africa Online client, but somehow they built it better, faster, more elegantly. And we were like all stunned that this startup is taking clients away from Africa Online. So when Kevin went and I lost my web developer and I had to find somebody else, I remember I made a trip to Nairobi on a client visit or a client trip because I was so good in selling. I was even had clients in Nairobi from Mombasa. I actually managed to close accounts from Mombasa. And I had a trip where I was visiting or spending some time with one or two of my clients in Nairobi. And Kevin arranged for me to meet them. So I went to their office on Gong Road, got to see the Three Mice operation. And I remember being shocked because it was an absolute startup. It was a small apartment. There was a handful of computers, a few guys. I don't even think they had a lease line at the time. And I met Ken for the first time. And I remember just being blown away that this small operation was actually winning some of the biggest website accounts at the time. And I just remember thinking to myself, my God, I need to work with these guys. I need to find a way to work here because it just felt like that moment, like somebody telling you, "This is Facebook. Would you like to work here?" So we had wonderful conversations with Ken, and I think we knew some mutual people, some mutual friends, and they just sounded like the guys who understood the future of content in this market. And I remember the time, I was in Mombasa, I was doing my work, but it became also very evident to me that I wanted to play in a bigger uh, pond, or I wanted to be in a bigger fish tank. And I was getting a bit frustrated. I felt like I was constrained. I was not achieving my full potential in Mombasa. So I kept kind of like hinting to the team in Nairobi at Afcon, and I'd like to move over. I'd like to move over. And no one was really listening to me. So at some point, out of frustration and just not being motivated, I said, you know what? It's okay. I resigned from my position. I had no game plan. I'd been talking to Three Mice for a few months. No offer was forthcoming. And I just quit. And what I did is I remember I literally got on a bus, came to Nairobi, and I spent, I think, the next month hanging out in Nairobi. I'd made a good number of commissions and I could just hang out for a while. And my thing is basically I literally harassed them to hire me. I mean, I spent so much time with them. They were more concerned about what it would cost to hire someone like me. I took a big pay cut, but I said, if I work with these guys, I will learn everything I need to know about the internet, especially around the content space. And that's what I did. So I think it was just before the millennium, I think just 1999. I think it was 2 or 3 months before that, the end of the year, I joined Three Mice after spending a month in Nairobi, partying and relaxing after I resigned. And I started working for them. Now, coincidentally and concurrently, what happened in that period of time is Africa Online acquired Three Mice. And in fact, part of the reason why they hired me is because they now had the resources to hire high caliber people like myself. So we joined them really at the point where they now had moved out of their small office. They got a nice location in Kileleshwa. It was a big house. They got all this funding. I think it was $500,000 to accelerate the business. But within that, what was actually happening is that Africa Online was also putting a very significant focus on their content business. So this AfricaOnline.com was now funded to a very large amount. They had some big money going into that. And Three Mice essentially became the vehicle to realize that vision of that content business. And effectively, what they will do then is take over Africa Online's content business in terms of the portal, as well as the services business where they're building and managing websites for clients. So I joined at that point when that transition was happening, which was very fortuitous because now they could take me on board. I could start working here, start working with big organizations, and really starting to sit at the front seat of where the content business was going in this country.
That's very interesting. Now, that story has played out many times in the tech space where there's a big giant who is doing very well in the space, then a small unknown player comes in and takes over the market. And you join this quote unquote smaller player, which then merged with Africa Online. In hindsight, do you think that was a good move for Africa Online acquiring Three Mice?
I think it was mutually needed because let's be honest, I think at Africa Online they kind of reached the end of what they understood about content, right? I think the content business had been somewhat peripheral until that point. Three Mice was clearly, eating into their market share, winning the big accounts. And it was very clear to me that the guys at Three Mice, Paul Kukubo, Betty Mwangi, who's now Paul Kukubo's wife, and then also Ken Joroge, the Three Mice themselves, understood this space better than Africa Online did. We had a very sort of corporate, sort of old school technology leaning perspective. Three Mice had this sort of, .com feel about them. They were new, they were fresh, they understood the space, they were unrestrained, they were creative. They just felt like the new, exciting kids in town. So I think the convergence was good in terms of they both got what they needed. There's Africa Online had a business that could build a very potentially very expensive portal that would be world class. They were not doing a particularly good job at managing and holding on to their big corporate accounts. Three Mice were eating into that market share. I would say that it was almost like building a moat. It was a protective strategy to keep their market and also make sure their customers would be happy. So clearly, what happened is Three Mice then suddenly had a massive client list, and that was a big challenge. And that's why people like us had to come in because now they had to service all these big banks and insurance companies and government businesses that were relying on them to manage and build these websites for them at the time, run campaigns and so forth. At the same time, Three Mice managed to scale very rapidly without having to, seek loans and other resources to grow the business. So I think it was a almost a marriage made in heaven at that point, in the sense that they both got things that they needed. Three Mice was cash strapped, bootstrapped, incapable of growing much bigger than they were at the point organically. Africa Online had the clients, but was not able to deliver the work as fast and as well as they needed to. Bring the two together, and the idea was that the synergies would make it a success.
You mentioned something which I'd like you maybe to give us more clarity on. What happened during the dot-com bubble burst? How did that impact your operations here or the business, the technology business space in Kenya or in Africa in general?
I think the .com bubble really practically sidestepped Africa. Let's be honest, right? We're not really on the map to begin with. But any business that had international funding from internet players globally suffered. And Africa Online actually ended up being one of the ones that suffered some of those consequences. Not because the local market was unviable, but more so because the benefactors, who at one point was Prodigy, which was a massive ISP in the US at some point. They had African Lakes. There's a very strong technology leaning, but there was this international aspect to the business, which meant that if they were suffering in markets in London or North America, then the cascading effect came to Africa. And in fact, around the time when I first joined Africa Online, there was a very real possibility of it shutting down because they had sort of fallen out with their investors back in the US with Prodigy before African Lakes came in. And all of that was part of the, shall I call it, the overarching impact of the .com from the investor side. But within the local market space, as you can imagine, it was still so nascent that there was really no .com bust in Africa. We were just on the ramp getting started, which is very different to where we are today. So I would say that the impact was in the businesses that had internationally aligned investors and interests, as opposed to those that were run locally and operating in the local market.
Interesting. So you're doing all this, you're at the top of your career. I'm sure at some point the thought of starting something your own came up. What would you say are the key lessons that you drew from your past experiences when you're working in these companies that made you believe that you are ready for the next step?
Yeah, I think for me, a lot of my entrepreneurial leaning comes from my father. And this had to do with the fact that he was essentially an entrepreneur, and he started his own practice. He used to be employed, and I remember at a very young age, having this situation where when he started his own business, he struggled. Of course, he did, and we noticed that as children, suddenly there was no conflicts. It was just cat and a blue band. We went to lower cost schools. We saw the impact of him being an entrepreneur. He'd leave, drop us in school, and would not see him again until the next morning because he'd come late at night. So I saw the struggle, but also I saw the reward, meaning when he finally cracked it, we saw a very high quality of life as a family. So I had a very sort of what I call a first person perspective on what it takes to do a business and also to succeed. And that for me meant that there was always this sort of a notion or a Harvard view that one day I would be an entrepreneur. I don't know where that came from, but I always thought to myself, I would want to do my own thing. And my dad actually used to tell us, my late father used to say, guys, I really want you guys, when you get to the working age, find a way to do your own thing. It's the most satisfying thing. You're responsible for success and failure at the same time, but it's completely under your control. So all along as I was doing all this stuff, I knew that in the back of my mind, one day I would want to do my own thing. And the way that it happened was actually without me really planning for it. Because you see, when I was working at 3 Miles, there were many instances where I would meet SMEs and other businesses that did not necessarily meet the threshold of the kind of rate cards we were working with. Because we're working with the biggest banks, the biggest insurance companies, they were paying hundreds of thousands of shillings, which was a fortune then for a website. But then you'd meet a small travel agency, you'd meet a small, biashara, and this guy tells you, well, I don't have 300K, but I have 50K. I have 100K, I have 20K. And I didn't really intend to take on the business, but something happened on my personal side where one of my family members was ill, and I knew that I had to find ways of making more money than I was at that point in time. So it kind of happened to me, meaning that I knew that I had the ability, I did not mind hard work. I knew that I wasn't necessarily making enough money. And a client actually just told me, like, listen, I mean, you know the stuff, you clearly can do this. I don't have this kind of budget. I have a small budget, but could you help me get what I need? I don't want to go to the market and look for an alternative because I like you. And there it started. I didn't even have a company. I didn't have a business. I I started moonlighting, working at night, working on weekends, working with a colleague. And the whole idea was not to do anything that was, shall I call it, conflict of interest? Because these are customers who would never have entered our client list anyway, given that they couldn't afford it. So effectively, it was a side hustle, right? So it started off being, one client, two clients, then word of mouth. Suddenly, I had five, six, seven clients, and I remember sitting down and saying, "Okay, now I need to actually register a company because I'm getting personal checks, and this doesn't work anymore for me." And I remember my lawyer friend had just come back from the UK and set up his own practice. Talked to him. He said it's going to cost me a certain amount of money. Incorporated the business, and it started to happen. And remember, for me, it was working at night, working on weekends, trying to make this extra money to support my lifestyle, but also the responsibilities I had within my family. And in process of doing so, it got to a point where the business was actually accelerating so fast that it now became for me a problem to continue being employed whilst trying to set up this little startup, which at the time I was running out of my little place where I was living. And sure enough, I remember sitting down and talking to a few colleagues and saying, why don't we start a business? I'm already servicing a few clients. Would you join me? No one was interested. And as luck would have it, my lawyer, the same one who'd incorporated the company, said, hang on a second. There's a friend of mine called Robert Koech, who has just come back from the US. He's got a degree in electronic engineering. He's got computers, he's got an office, he's ready to set up something, but his project or whatever he's trying to do is not getting off the ground. You're trying to set up something, but you don't have really much funding, but you have a few clients. Why don't I hook you two up and you guys can possibly work together? So we had a meeting. We pretty much had a very simple MOU that we signed. The company was registered as .savvy at that point. We moved into his office. We had computers. We had an interconnection. A couple of my former colleagues joined us. Two guys that I'd worked with at 3 Miles. One had resigned. I think one had been fired. So I brought those two in, a lady and a guy. And the four of us basically started working. And we're very fortunate because even when I resigned from 3 Miles, as events would have it, I literally had come with, I think, one client to pick up a check from their offices. I think it was Avenue Healthcare. And these guys had given me a check, I think, of 200,000 bob or something. And I was literally taking the check to them. And during that meeting, I was now relaying the sad news that I'm moving on. And the lady took the check back and said, okay, we're not moving forward until your business is operational and you can come back to us. So imagine I'd gone to pick a check and they were so confident that they took the check back. I remember I'd been talking to ABC Bank at the time as one of our first clients, one of our very first clients. And similarly, when I told them I'm moving on, they said, it's okay, we'll work with you when you're ready. And that was interesting because you realize that some people were so confident that even with a young startup, they were willing to work with us with very little, shall I say, goodwill for us to be a good supplier. And that was really a blessing from God because we started off very luckily with some good corporate clients paying good money and we're working on their websites literally from day one.
profile keeps on rising. All of a sudden, the NASPAS group is here, and they're looking at setting up something again. I think it was Greenfish at that time.
Yeah, so I want to just go two steps back to say there's actually a pivotal moment that happened before that, which was as we were running along and we're doing business. I remember at some point, I think we had like 10 banks, like 8 insurance companies. We could do no wrong. I mean, we were flying, you know. We were up there with Three Mines, we were up there with Metrocomia. Those were the endemic agencies. We were sitting right at the top with them. But a lot of these businesses at that point were built specifically for developing and managing websites, because that was the internet back then. But the thing that changed the game for us is the day when social media became now the thing. So kind of moving into the mid 2000s, 2005, 6, 7, 8. Number two, the other transition that happened around the same time is we used to get a lot of business from the traditional ad agencies, okay, the scan ads and so forth. That's how we did work for people like Kenya Power and so forth. And one day these guys woke up and realized, hang on a second, why are we outsourcing work when we can do this in-house? Okay. So imagine you have all the banks, you have all the insurance companies, you guys have three companies have all the market to themselves at that level. And one day some of your biggest benefactors decide that they want to also play in the digital space. So quite dramatically, I remember the incident that we knew were in trouble was when I think Scanad was launching Squad Digital, and we saw the job ads being circulated online. And the moment I saw the job descriptions for the roles they were hiring for, I forwarded that email to Robert, my co-director, and I told him, Robert, we are in trouble. We are out of our depth. Because the roles that they're defining, the descriptions they had written that we had not even imagined in our business. Because remember, we had finally tuned and finally honed our business to be the very best web development and sort of marketing services around web from top to bottom. Everything we did was focused on that. Then suddenly people are saying social media community manager. I was like, what the hell is that? I don't know what that is. I don't know how it works. And then the next thing is once that was happening, we started getting calls from the same clients we had, people like NIC Bank, ICA Lion, all these accounts. And they were basically telling us, Moses, we're moving back to Scanet, we're moving back to Squad, they're going to take over the work you're doing. I remember being in a meeting with one of our clients, and these guys, I think at that point, were paying, 200,000 shillings a month. That was critical to our business. And we sat in a room and we're just told, you're handing over, it's over. And, the agency is now going to take over your business you've been doing for them. So as the big agencies started to consolidate and build these digital departments, the next thing that happened was the talent flight. So many of our employees were offered 2, 3 times their salaries of what we could afford. And many of them were told leave within a week or within 3 days. So imagine you have a status meeting on a Friday evening. You've got your 7, 8 guys sitting in the room. You've talked to all your big accounts. There's certain deliverables due next week. You have your project plan set up. You get in your car, leave the office, you arrive home, and you see 7 resignation letters. And they're not saying next week. They're saying, I have left. And you just pay them their salaries that day. They're not picking their phones. They're not in touch. You have clients waiting for deliverables. It is what is called a near-death experience in your business. We had to hire fresh, bring in new people. At the same time, we lost accounts. At the same time, those employees went to work with some of the bigger companies. It's kind of like what's happening right now, apparently, with people like Microsoft and others who are apparently picking up a lot of tech talent in the market from smaller companies. And I don't know how we survived it. I think it was just the grace of God. I don't know how we got through it till today. But that was a catalyst to my move to NASPAS because things got very tough. Me and my co-director, were not entirely aligned on where things were going when things started to get tough. And as that was all happening, it became very clear that things were getting a bit tense in the business. So I remember very clearly at that point in time, I think it was my wife who saw some job ad online, believe it or not. At this point, you're an entrepreneur, you're meant to succeed, you're meant to fight through the challenges and succeed, but things were really tough. And you're losing employees, you're losing clients. It was bad. And this job ad comes out, and my wife forwards and says, have a look, maybe it's worth trying. I look at it, and you got to remember at this time that I've already been blogging for a number of years, right? I'm writing content, I'm attending all these things, I go to the iHubs and stuff. I built a name for myself as a blogger where people know me as a technology person who understands what's happening in the digital ecosystem. So as all this is happening, I just send my CV to these guys, and I think I get a phone call within 30 minutes. And the call comes from South Africa, and it's a lady asking me, my boss is asking whether it's really you who's applied for this job. And this is where I think young people need to understand the power of personal branding. because apparently these guys had been listening and reading my blog for better part of 2 3 years to understand what's happening in the local ecosystem. Because remember, even when the media were publishing stories, they tend to be repurposed press releases, whereas people like you and I, Tom, would be sitting down, understanding at a fundamental level what's happening on the ground. So because of that richness and authenticity of that content, they actually saw me as a newspaper that was telling them what happens in Kenya, because they had designs on building their own startups in this market, hence Dealfish and so forth. So 30 minutes later, I get this call. They then invite me for an interview, I think the very next day. They want to still confirm that it's really me who applied because they know who I am online. And I think I had a job offer within 3 days, and I think I joined them within 2 weeks. But here's the best part: the money I was going to get paid, the perks and everything. I mean, I just signed. I was having a lot of trouble in the company. I elevated one of my employees to become the GM. Of course, I would check in every end of day to see what's happening in the business. But this was peace of mind. Young family at the time, little baby. I just had to start my life. So I felt like, let me step away from being too close to the business. But more importantly, had this great opportunity to set up a new business called Dealfish, which was going to become the largest, and it still is the largest classifieds business in this part of the world, although now it's known as GG after being changed from Dealfish to OLX and then GG. And that's something we achieved across Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. And I think the interesting thing there was that you get to do a startup with a well-funded business behind it. Yeah. So we had money for advertising, we had money to hire the best talent, we had resources to travel and do things. And for me, that was an interesting experience because my entire time being an entrepreneur, it had always been bootstrapped and financially challenging. And now suddenly I'm doing a startup with all the money I need to do whatever I wanted to do. We did TV commercials, we did radio ads, we did everything that you could do with a brand. So, literally, you could almost say that whatever the Jumias and all are doing today, we were the ones who did it for the first time when Naspers came into the market and set up businesses like Dealfish, Mocality, Kalahari, if you can remember all those startups that they did in this region.
So you are in Big Fish at that time. It's a pretty good new approach to how things are done. Do you have any wow moments or moments where you look back and realize that maybe previously in your career you didn't know what you were doing, or things have taken a drastic shift from what you thought the direction was to where you are now going?
I think joining Naspers and joining Dealfish was such a blessing because it just opened me up to an entirely new world in the digital space that I didn't even know. Because remember, I'd been on the consulting side, building websites, serving customers with our services. Now I'm on the side of building a product, building a platform, trying to create consumer demand on the side of the platform, learning what it takes to run ads properly. I remember we had a company in South Africa called Traffic Brand that used to do our Google and Facebook ads. It's the first time I saw a really scientific approach to running digital advertising, using software and data science to optimize campaigns. It's the first time I understood how a scalable digital platform is built from the ground up and the problems you get with the bugs and issues when you want to meet customer requirements, but your developers have only so much capacity to do innovations and things on your platform. Dealing with user interfaces across mobile, desktop, and so forth. So it was an entirely new world. And I think I would not be where I am today without the experiences of doing that at Dealfish for the odd 2 years or so that I was there. And I'm really proud of what we achieved. But more importantly, it was a moment of understanding where you don't know what you don't know until you get there. And for me, that exposure was critical because sometimes you get stuck in a very myopic perspective as an entrepreneur, and there are other things happening around you that you're blind to because you're in this tunnel vision. But when you're working with these other guys, you're seeing what they're doing in other markets. Like I remember I went to Poland, for Harvard conference where Harvard professors were taking us through business models and stuff of digital businesses. And you're talking to guys from Ukraine, you're talking to guys from Poland, from those markets where there's a website I remember that was doing $100,000 a day in revenue on an instant messaging app that was very popular in Eastern Europe that you and I have never heard of. So you just opens your eyes to wow. And then Naspers as a business, the digital side of the business, forget multi-choice and all the other products we know, but the things that they're doing in Eastern Europe and Asia, I mean, it was just mind-blowing to see how big this ecosystem actually was. And more so in emerging markets as opposed to well-established markets like the US or mainstream Europe. So that for me was incredibly eye-opening and impactful to the work I was doing at the time.
I think one thing that's coming out of what you're sharing with us is guys were doing all these things, the mobile technology space starts picking up. And all of a sudden, the definition of who a customer is changes to from being a corporate entity to an individual. Mobile
Consumer.
devices are starting to proliferate.
3Gs in the market.
3Gs in the market. Handset prices are coming down, and there's a lot of shift from the desktop to mobile as far as content is concerned. How did you handle that? And following that question is, you also worked for InMobi. Was it because of what was happening in the market, or just another opportunity that you saw and took?
Again, InMobi was a bit of a weird one. It kind of happened to me, and because what happened is at Dealfish, we were using InMobi as one of our advertising platforms to create demand and awareness of what we're doing at Dealfish. And incidentally, the lady who was running InMobi in Africa at the time was Isis Nyongo. Isis was somebody I already knew. We'd interacted with her before. In fact, I think in the early days of Dotsavi, I tried to hire her when she just come back from the US. And that didn't work out. But more importantly, we knew each other as friends. And they were there and they were a new startup. And I remember for me, when I heard about InMobi the first time, I remember being very surprised that I heard that Isis had left Google to join a startup called InMobi. I was like, how did that happen? I mean, I just couldn't imagine somebody leaving Google to join a startup from India called InMobi. So for me, that was the first sign that there must be something interesting here if ISIS took that jump, you know. But obviously, she was getting a promotion. She was moving from a senior position to being in a leadership position, running in the entire Africa operation of this new startup. Subsequently, as we're having all these conversations, I remember, I don't know how it happened, but I think ISIS sent me the link because ISIS and I had interacted a lot when I was at Savvy, and we were running ad campaigns for some of our clients like Old Mutual on Google on their behalf. So we knew each other from a business perspective. I don't know whether that was it. I don't know if it's because I was a blogger and she kind of used to follow my content. But I do believe, if I remember correctly, she reached out to me and said, Moses, there's a position in Mobi that I think would be perfect for you. And as it turns out, initially you're like, oh, I don't think so. I'm comfortable. I'm happy. And she just told me, come on, just try. You never know how it goes. And it was a sales position, which is something that's always been part of my career and what I've done in digital. It was going to be a Pan-African position, whereas in Dealfish it was regional, East Africa. In Mobi, it was going to be across the African continent, at least sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, mobile was becoming this thing. You know, the smartphones were coming out, data was getting cheaper. Uptake of internet and consumer markets were growing. My exposure at Dealfish had clearly indicated to me that mobile was the future because we'd look at our data insights and we could see that the traffic on feature phones and smartphones and all these things were telling us mobile is the future. And in Mobi, at the heart of it was a mobile advertising platform. So when you kind of looked at it, it looked kind of like it worked well with the fact that I'd come from a digital marketing agency. I'd worked in a digital consumer product business in Dealfish. And now there's this Pan-African opportunity in an emerging startup that had just raised $200 million from SoftBank that was going big on Africa. And they were hiring a kick-ass team that's going to potentially transform the mobile advertising space. InMobi had ambitions to take on the Googles and so forth head to head with their products. They were ambitious. So I went through probably 8 interviews, different levels of management, all the way to the CEO at InMobi. This was all done virtually back in the day when Skype used to be the thing. And I remember sometimes I was almost exhausted. I was like, this is so rigorous. But I only truly appreciated how ambitious InMobi was when I got the position. And I think within a week or two, I had to fly to the headquarters in Bangalore. And there was a sales conference there. And this is literally day 1, day 2 of me working there, just after I think the December 2011 holidays. And I reached there and I see guys from all over the world, Eastern Europe, you know, um, you know, Asia, and all these different markets. And one thing I noticed that was a common denominator. All these guys were from, ex Google, ex Microsoft, ex HP, ex you name it. They were all like top tier technology alumni. And I remember thinking to myself at some point is how did I get here? How am I in this company? Because all these guys are so incredibly successful and top tier people. And that was clearly the indication of the ambition of the business. They were going for a global market. But get there, and what I do remember very clearly is that it was because I was in Mobi for only about, I think, 11 or 12 months, because in Mobi shut down key markets. I think it was around October, November of 2012. But it was a very intense period. We sold like crazy. We spent a lot of time in West Africa, acquiring customers for our advertising. Did a lot of work in Kenya, of course, as expected. Ghana, Egypt. I opened up those markets for Inmobi. But it was I've never worked possibly as hard as I did when I did that work at Inmobi. It was intense. It was exciting. It was exhilarating. But wow, I mean, within a year, our year-on-year growth, I think, was something like 300%. So the scaling, the growth with a very small team was incredible. And again, a wonderful experience to see the other side of the pond. To see what it takes to build a startup at a global scale and build a footprint from nothing within the African continent.
It's quite interesting because while you are doing that, something significant will also happen in the market where previously the content that you were working on was mostly focused on businesses and sales.
Yeah.
But now with mobile devices and mobile connectivity, infotainment starts coming up. People are now concerned about what was the game score last night, which celebrity said this, and there's a shift or segmentation of the content space. One of the major areas where content has really picked is in the sports side. And I believe you found yourself in one of these organizations, known as DSN.
The Perform Group, formerly the Perform Group, which is now known as the Zone. Yeah.
The Zone. So, tell us about that time.
Yeah, so Inmobi shuts down in Africa, in Russia, in Sweden, and a whole bunch of other markets because the team at SoftBank apparently said, you know what, we've invested $200 million in you guys. You're spread too thin. We need to get you focused on the markets you need to win, which I think was logical. They needed to win North America. They needed to win, markets like Southeast Asia. They needed to win Europe. And they basically took away anything that was peripheral, even though we're growing like, 300% plus, within Africa. So what happened is that during my time at Inmobi, we used to work with what is the Perform Group, which is the company that owns Goal.com and also Soccerway, which are two of the biggest football destinations. So we, in particular in West Africa, would use our linkage with Goal.com to sell advertising through our platform into those markets. So we were essentially a ad partner of Goal.com on mobile. And in that time, I got to interact with the guys from the Perform Group. We used to meet them in Lagos with mutual clients. And the whole idea was that we'd work together to try and generate more sales for them and, use our networks to essentially make both companies more successful. In so doing, one of the guys there became aware of the fact that obviously Mobi was pulling out. And Moses now basically went back to Dotsavi and of course, we had a general manager there. So I was not trying to be too invasive. I kind of came in. I got a good payoff from Inmobi, so I put a bit of money back into my business to refurbish the place and get the place a little bit better. It was kind of doing okay, but it couldn't support me as an employee. But in the middle of all this guy calls me and says, "Okay, Moses, we're looking for somebody to run our East Africa sales thing, and I met you. You look like a good guy. Would you be interested? And I remember the time I was doing, I think, the Pivot East in 2013 with the guys at the M Lab and also the iHub. And I think Eric Herzman had reached out to me and said, would you like to run Pivot this year? And I was not really doing anything. I just come out of Inmobi. I'm kind of in Dotsavi. I'm kind of like ambling. I'm not too sure what I'm going to do. So I took on the running of Pivot East in 2013. And in the midst of all this, I remember I was in Rwanda when I had the call and the interview with the Africa vice president to discuss the possibility of me joining them as their East Africa regional manager. And as all this was happening, it was going to be a good commercial opportunity, but I knew the platform. I knew Goal.com was a very strong sports portal. And this, remember, was a precursor to the launch of the Sport Pesas and all at the time. So I go in, I'm open-minded, I learn everything about football. Again, I'm selling advertising just like I did in Inmobi, but now this is a dedicated platform. It's a popular platform across Africa I'm working remotely, mostly working from home even back then. And I started working on sales. And as it turned out, within a short period of time, I bring on the Coca-Colas because it was a World Cup year in 2014. I bring on the football endemic brand, so to speak, so the beer brands and so forth. And at this point, there's no sports betting yet, right? And I remember one day, I don't know where I was. I think I was on Mombasa Road or something, and I saw the banners and the billboards for Sport Pesa. So immediately in my mind, the light bulb goes off. This is a mobile betting platform for sports. I go online, I try and find out where their office is. I find out that they're the Samia Office Park. I drive in there and ask Askari, where's this Sport Pesa place? I get into this room where I see some Eastern European guys smoking and hanging out on couches. And I say, okay, I need to speak to your marketing manager. And they're like, well, we don't really have a marketing manager, but you can talk to that guy. And I go see this guy, then he introduces me to a lady. Then I meet a guy who used to work at Safaricom, a guy called Raja, who somehow is now in Sport Pesa because I think he understood the whole M-Pesa thing. And we have a conversation, and I think 3 or 4 days, they become my biggest customer for advertising. Spending something like, I think, $20,000, or I don't remember how much per month. So suddenly, with all my other football brands and, sport, consumer beverages and all, I now bring on my first betting customer. And of course, after that, we bring in all the rest of them. So me, that was kind of transformative because this was an entirely virgin greenfield opportunity around people using mobile devices and M-Pesa to bet on sports and football games at scale. And of course, as you know, Sport Pesa went on to even invest in advertising in Formula One. They sponsored, Premier League teams. I mean, it was incredible. The growth was stratospheric. But for sure, that created an acceleration in terms of the use cases of M-Pesa and entertainment and mobile, as you put it, in a way, in a scale that we had never seen before. And I feel very privileged to have somehow been part of that moment because I was involved in, the Zone or Perform Group and working on Goal.com. Hope I'm not boring you to death, huh?
No, no, no. Passion for sales. You can speak to that and how important that has been for
My career, yeah. Okay, great. I think sales for me is something that I stumbled into, to be honest. I think when I left USIU, um, I I dabbled. As you know, I tried to get into this internet thing at some point, and things were not happening. So what happened is one of my brothers had been in the US and he came back, and the usual thing, he was stomaching, sending out his CV, nothing's happening. I was kind of in between, not yet sure what I was gonna do. And quite literally, we went for a drink with a friend of ours, and he tells us, you know what, there's a lot of money in seafood. If you can buy and sell seafood at the right price to hotels, because of course we're in Mombasa then you make good money. So we sort of did our homework. And because I have a Tanzanian background, I discovered that apparently, you can buy seafood in Tanzania in a place called Tanga at a very low price and bring it in. And after you pay your duties and all, it's still going to give you a good margin. So this was complete ignorance. Like we didn't know what we're doing. We're just young guys trying to make the way forward. And we had a little bit of money and we go buy this stuff. We bring it here. It was poorly packed, poorly presented. But I'll never forget one of the hotel people said, this is really great product, but you just haven't packaged it properly. But more importantly, we got the second batch, it was better. And then for some reason, we couldn't seem to sell to anyone. And at this point, I knew nothing about sales. I had not been trained in sales. I don't know how it works. And I'll never forget kind of like reading a book. Like I remember I mentioned, I used to spend a lot of time in the British Council, and I came across a sales book. And I read this book, and it talked about all these techniques in selling. And the next day, I remember we had stock of a deep freezer or two full of this product. We used to mostly deal in prawns and lobsters and stuff like that, which are high margin products. And we couldn't sell it anywhere. And I said, why are we selling to the mid-tier, lower-tier restaurants who can't afford it or can't buy volume? Why don't we go to the biggest customers? So if you know anything about the Tamarind Group, which are the guys who own Carnival and all, they're very big in the hospitality space. And in Mombasa in particular, the Tamarind restaurant is renowned globally for seafood. And we knew we had a great product. So I remember getting an ice box from the house, at home. I put samples of the product. I put parsley and everything, made it look good. And I went to see the head chef at Tamarind and tell him, look, I've got this great product. Would you buy it? And there's a way that they break the head of the prawn and smell it. And he says, well, this is great stuff. How much do you have? And I think I told him, I think we have 60 kilos. And he just told me, bring all of it. And I was like, what? Bring all of it. So we had a small Suzuki vehicle. We had previously moved the back seat, so it acted as a pickup. And I remember spending, I think, 3 trips. If you know what 60 kilos of prawn looks like in boxes and all, it is a lot of food. So we did like 3 trips to Tamarind restaurant. We sold the entire inventory we had, placed our new orders, and they became one of our customers working out of the house. Um, what was that? That was instructive in teaching me a very fundamental point of sales. Sales is all about how you package and present your proposition so that the other party will buy it. So even I had gone dressed well, I think I put on a tie and everything, but the way I packaged myself showed me that you can turn around any situation through sales. If you can get the other party to invest or purchase your product or service because you have elevated it to the point that it's worth, then people will buy it. And that for me kind of started my journey in selling because now, without any training, I now understood a fundamental point. It's all about how you communicate and package and demonstrate your value proposition that gets people to buy. So from that point onwards, I think the other sort of significant sales experiences I had was probably the training I got when I was working at Africa Online. Africa Online was a startup, as you know. They were very sales strong, and they had significant sales training built into the organization. And in particular, I'll never forget one of the people who I met who really shaped me as a person in sales, a guy called Patrick Malungu. He's a Ugandan who was the head of sales at Africa Online at some point. He's the guy who should train us. He had been in the US, um, took us to a lot of sales training programs, got outside consultants to train us. But it got to a point where the language, the way you conduct yourself, the way you dress, the way you speak to people, you just become a sales machine. And you never stop learning. You're constantly looking at ways of getting better at this process because it's a difference between success and failure in many businesses, especially in B2B, B2B business. So for me, at the heart of it is like, yes, I'm a technology enthusiast, I'm a digital marketer, I'm a digital entrepreneur, but there's a very strong sales story in there because even Dotsavi, as I mentioned, we had customers before even we pursued the possibility of funding, which we never actually have ever had. We've always had business being the fundamental source of revenue as a result of sales. How does that Yeah. I think we live in a very fortuitous moment right now because through the internet, through social media, through lower cost of internet access, the fact that we're all connected on the mobile device or in our homes, the barriers to entry have never been lower. But more importantly, in a world where everyone is digitally hooked, the power of building your personal brand opens doors. Like I mentioned, the reason I went to NASPAS is because they're already consuming my content. In Mobi was also as a result of that. But basically, you're selling yourself through thought leadership and sharing knowledge freely to the world, which then positions you in a certain way in front of people. Some of the lessons I've learned, I think, through the years is that the biggest challenge that I think any person in sales or any startup faces is the challenge of obscurity. If somebody doesn't even know you exist, how can they buy from you, right? And that means that at every opportunity, whether it's attending conferences, events, being on, even Twitter Spaces, reaching out to people on LinkedIn, all of these are ways of driving sales. And even when, like I mentioned, working with organizations like, people like, Gold.com and others, I did a lot of digital research and reaching out to people to sell product and service because a lot of it is also, again, digitally driven today, being able to essentially mine the internet to find your contacts, find the people you need to sell to, and sell at the right premium. Another thing is that I've also always been biased towards selling high value, high margin products versus high volume, lower margin products. And that's just because of my B2B leaning from the time I started working. It's always been about face to face, one on one, and selling at a high level. But again, if you're the guy who's in the right places at the right time, networking with the right people, being in, things like the Rotary clubs, being part of the community in terms of things that are happening on the ground, then invariably you cultivate a reputation that becomes the means through which you can then establish a strong sales platform. So for me, the number one issue is obscurity at an individual level and also at an organizational level. If you can address those two issues through digital platforms and also through traditional one-on-one marketing or interaction, then you can be very successful. Yeah, we could have. And I think when all this money started coming into the ecosystem, I remember thinking to myself, this is an illusion. Right now, there's a massive correction happening in North America. The tech the tech, the big techs are going through a massive correction of value. Recession is very much at our doors. And a lot of it has been during these wonderful 20 years when people have been easily raising funding and accelerating their businesses. And every time I see a raise, like even recently in Kenya, and even in Africa, we're seeing raises of $250 million, $30 million is considered small amounts now. The big question mark I always ask myself is: these businesses or these startups, are they going to be financially viable in the next 2 to 5 years? Even with all this funding, are they going to be able to generate sales? And I remember when I started seeing the ecosystem growing, there's a lot of activity, but I couldn't quite tell whether any of these startups were actually going to be viable business. Like I said, I come from a strong sales background. I believe in a very fundamental point of you need to have a product or service that is sellable, that people will find value from, and that essentially keeps the machinery running. If that product or service is not viable and sustainable, then you don't really have a business, right? You have a charity. It takes money and it consumes it, right? So, long and short of it, I think I would say that as much as there's a great onus and a great, shall I almost call it addiction right now to raising money to drive startups, I think there needs to be a stronger perspective around how do you create a sustainable business based on the basics of a business that sells a product or service that creates value for the customer, and within that there's enough of a margin that can actually keep your business viable financially. It's a tough one, because I mean, if you're in a local business and you're trying to, how shall we put this? You're trying to build this new startup to address a market opportunity. Um, I think one of the big challenges there is obviously money is money, right? And especially in many cases, I remember some of my former employees who had left telling me, Moses, I'm so sorry I had to do it that way, but I have my sister in school, my father is sick. The extra money I'm going to make will allow me to take care of myself and my family. Many of them were not leaving because they were not happy. They were leaving because they needed more money. And for me, that was very painful because our internal revenues did not allow us to pay them what they were really worth. And even till today, I believe most of our employees, me included, are underpaid. We're not able to pay those premiums that a Google or a Facebook or a Microsoft can pay. In light of all of that, I think I'm reminded of that book called, I think, David versus Goliath. If you read that book, one of the things I took away from it is we always look at it through the lens of the big organization has come and taken my people because I'm the small people. But I think we need to look at our smaller startups and ask ourselves, what can we be exceptionally and exceedingly better at than any one of these bigger companies? Remember the example I gave you of Three Mice? They're already eating into Africa Online, irrespective of the acquisition, but they didn't have the internal revenue to necessarily grow as fast as they could have if they were acquired. And I think the question should almost be: is there any way of creating something that is truly unique and truly competitive that no one else can replicate easily? And that, I think, is the moat that you need to start thinking about as a business. That if you're seen as just another startup, then what is going to be there? Number two, are you able to offer your employees other incentives beyond just a salary, such as maybe shareholding, which could potentially allow them to stay on until the business becomes successful? Let us not forget the lessons of companies like, let's say, Kenjeroge Cellulant, which over time struggled a lot, but right now, in I think over, is it 17 African markets, working with over 100 banks. I mean, those guys have completely scaled up, but they needed at some point to get the funding to move to the next level. And they are competing for the best talent, just like the other big companies from outside. So there's got to be an opportunity to sort of say, what can we do well? What can we do better than anyone else? And then how do we scale that up over time so that even as our employees might be underpaid, as we start to grow, they will gradually get them to the point where they could be on the level of somebody working at a place like Google or Facebook or Microsoft, for instance. Yeah. I think for me, sometimes I have this view nowadays, maybe it's very philosophical, that sometimes a bad thing is good and sometimes a good thing is bad. I don't know whether that makes any sense, but I've learned that when things look too good to be true, they probably are, meaning that, even when things have been going well, it might be the very thing that makes you complacent. When you've had a bit of success, you don't do the rigors that you used to have before, and that can cost you business. It happened actually very recently when we were pitching for some business, and we are going up against a much younger company with much younger people. And the client just told us, "Look, man, these young guys go at it like you wouldn't believe. They did everything you guys did not do. They were more thorough. They were more driven. They were more willing to go the extra mile to win the business. Whereas we are kind of in a comfortable spot. We have clients, we have revenues. We are not as hungry as them. And I think that's one of the regrets I might have, that when you get a little bit of success, there's a risk of sort of laying back a little bit, which allows other people to steal your lunch. And that's something that happens to any business that grows. Number two, I tend to think about the opportunities that I see in the marketplace today, but sometimes realizing that I don't have the bandwidth or the capacity to pursue them. I have probably 20, 30, 40 ideas that are very viable, but I just don't have the bandwidth to pursue everything that is happening. And I think sometimes that sort of constraint is the fact that you're kind of stuck in a certain mental model of what you should be doing, and it's very hard to unpack yourself from that to do new things, because you also have the obligations of running another business day to day. So sometimes there are regrets because you are kind of looking at an idea like, I had that idea 10 years ago, I had that idea 5 years ago, I didn't do anything about it, somebody's minting now. So regrets around sometimes maybe ideas that I never actualized, maybe I documented, but I never put them into action, especially given the exposure I've had with all the different companies and organizations I've been involved with for the last, 20 years. Uh, Now that I'm settled down, happily married, moving into my elder years, I would say take more risks. And I know it sounds possibly a little bit cavalier, but the idea that when you're that young, you really don't have much holding you back. And I think if I had done more risky things in my 20s, I could be even more successful, could have achieved more things. But then in hindsight, you also realize you are where you're at because of everything you did and when you did it. So it's not always a perfect straight line. And even sometimes the setbacks are in themselves an opportunity to do something different. But I'll take probably more risks and be more ambitious around things I want to do. Yeah, I think I've been very, very fortunate because for me, the work I've done and the places I've worked, the mere fact that the underpinning driver has been something that is into, connected on, or based on the internet itself has been very rewarding because this is literally combining a passion of mine as a person with a day job, right? So basically, my day job is my hobby. And I think very few people get that opportunity where they can work every day and it's almost like playing in the garden or playing in the playground because everything for me is just new and shiny and exactly what I like. So for me, I think out of that process and over time, I've come to sort of appreciate the privilege that brings with it. And more importantly, the opportunity to share the benefits of that. Because remember, entire careers and industries have now been built on top of this internet thing. And, it didn't exist. My company, Dotsavi, has been around for 20 years. I've worked in this space now for almost 30 years, if you can imagine that, from the very, very beginning. An entire industry has flourished around this. So for me, I just feel like it's so instructive for me to share the things I've learned, things I've done. Part of the reason why I blog, because I feel there are points of view that I need to share, thoughts I need to put out there that are important. That's how even the blog started to begin with. I think with the training, I do a lot of digital training with a lot of organizations, as faculty and other positions. And I think that again is a huge privilege and honor where people see that I'm competent enough or credible enough to teach and share these insights. I do mentor some young people around this space, young entrepreneurs. There's one right now who I meet quite regularly to help him grow his business, which incidentally is also in the same space as we are. I've had the privilege of the 10,000 hours to know what to do and not to do. But the sharing and giving back for me comes in the form of training, comes in the form of sharing knowledge and insights, meeting, having conversations like this one, because there's so much to share. But I think the biggest passion for me now going forward, and the thing that is starting to irk me the most, especially post pandemic, is the plight of the SME. And I'm talking about the barber shop, I'm talking about the hairdresser, I'm talking about the guy who set up a small bakery in a small location and with all his hopes and savings has a business that's collapsing. And maybe it's only collapsing because of that problem I talked about called obscurity, that he makes great bread. He has a fantastic barbershop, but nobody knows he exists, or not enough people know that he exists. Or maybe he doesn't realize that he just needs to charge 100 shillings more per haircut and his business goes cash positive. That lack of knowledge and insight, and not even just for digital, is an area that I'm starting to think and feel that I need to do more around. Like, how do I take that person who's struggling in an SME, a startup like I was, 20 years ago, and help them succeed through the things that I learned work and the things that don't work? And more importantly, amplify and leverage technology to make that reality possible. I think for me, that's becoming a burning issue because I see too much failure, too many challenges, too many people struggling, especially in the SME space, that should be succeeding. And yet, many of them are struggling because they don't know what they don't know. And that, I think, for me, is probably the biggest itch that I want to scratch going forward.